Good evening. My name is Ella Layton, and I'm a student project manager at the Clark Forum for Contemporary Issues at Dickinson College. Before we begin, I would like to recognize that Dickinson College is on the unceded lands of the Susquehannock Nation. We hereby recognize the prior status and enduring diversity of this land and the many indigenous nations that stand in relation to it, particularly the thousands of indigenous children from dozens of tribes forced into the reprogramming camp established at the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in 1879. Dickinson College supported this agenda of cultural eradication both in word and deed. Turning honestly towards that shameful past animates this acknowledgement and gives orientation to our desire for a reconciled future. Accordingly, this living land acknowledgement is intentionally incomplete, a reflection of the ongoing process it represents to learn respectfully from the stories of this land and the peoples that carry them, to think reflectively about the injustice in our shared past, and to act responsibly with that knowledge today to inspire a more equitable tomorrow. On behalf of the Clark Forum, Dickinson College, the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, the Departments of American Studies and History, and the Law and Policy Program, I would like to welcome you to tonight's event, Race and the Origins of Modern Policing. The Black Lives Matter organization was founded in 2013 in response to the acquittal of the murderer of Trayvon Martin, a 17-year-old black boy. Trayvon's death and the acquittal of his murderer received significant media attention, but the movement's popularity notably increased during the summer of 2020 after George Floyd's murder. In the United States and abroad, people protested police brutality and racial violence. Advocates and allies demanded the defunding of their local police departments, believing that police reform would not stop the harm and violence done against people of color at the hands of police. The history of slave patrols and militarized policing in the United States convinced many Americans that the police system was built to exert racial violence. The system was not actually broken, it was working according to its design. Therefore, police reform was a futile effort toward the project of racial justice. From this political moment, a need emerged to examine the historical relationship between race and policing. Tonight, Dr. Guariglia will chronologize how we reached our current moment of technocratic and self-proclaimed colorblind policing that is characterized by the use of science and technology to perpetuate constant surveillance and over-policing of immigrant communities and communities of color. Matthew Guariglia, class of 2012, is a senior policy analyst at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, where he works on police surveillance and national security technology policy, and also serves on the advisory board for the peer-reviewed journal Surveillance and Society. He earned his master's at New York University and received his PhD at the University of Connecticut, where he wrote his dissertation on the history of policing immigrants in New York City. His thesis won the 2020 Outstanding Dissertation Award from the Immigration and Ethnic History Society. Guariglia is the author of Police in the Empire City, Race and the Origins of Modern Policing in New York. Additionally, he is the co-editor of the Essential Kerner Commission Report along with Jelani Cobb, and his bylines have appeared in NBC News, The Washington Post, Slate, Vice, Time Magazine, the Journal of American Ethnic History, and Surveillance and Society. There will be a question and answer session immediately following the program, so please hold all questions until that time. The Clark Forum welcomes differences of opinion expressed politely, thoughtfully, and succinctly. Disruptive behavior or harassment of the speakers, members of the Dickinson community, or audience members will not be tolerated. As a show of respect for our speaker and everyone in attendance, please stay until the end of the program, including the question and answer session. There will be a book sale and signing in the lobby immediately following the program. At this time, please silence all cell phones and other devices. In the event of emergency, accessible exits are located on the west side of the building behind the screen. And now, please join me in welcoming our guest, Dr. Matthew Guariglia.
Thank you so much, Ella. And thank you all for being here. I believe this is the Monday before spring break, so I really appreciate your attendance. I once knew what that felt like. And so I want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank the Clark Forum for hosting me. I especially want to thank Sarah Markowitz for helping to plan this whole thing. She and I are old friends, and I'm glad that we could work on this together. And also the members of the history department who are here today, especially I see Professor Bilodeau here. Thank you so much for coming. This is kind of a homecoming for me. So by way of a little introduction, I'm Matthew Guariglia. I'm an interdisciplinary scholar, historian, and activist focusing on the relationship between race, ethnicity, government power, and increasingly how technology is used to exert that power. While I've been writing and lecturing on this book, I've also spent the last almost 5 years now as a senior policy analyst working for one of the most impressive and forward-thinking civil liberties organizations in the country, trying to better understand how law enforcement uses and misuses technology. And as you'll see toward the end of the talk, it's really kind of shaped my thinking about the history as well. But because I'm here, I'll just start by saying that this book project and my interest in government and police power in general has many origins, but a few happen right here on this campus. Studying abroad in Norwich, I was very lucky to take a class with a former MI5 archivist, so like the FBI of England. And this woman who actually got to kind of handle the dirty secrets of the British government, all of their files and surveillance reports, she inspired me when I got back to Carlisle to file what she told me about, which is a Freedom of Information Act request. So for those of you who don't know, there is a law that entitles you access to public information, even if it's, even sometimes if it's classified. And so sitting in my dorm room in Baird McClintock, I began to send out requests to the FBI for their files on various writers and activists that I was interested in the 20th century. And before long, my hub box began filling up with FBI files. And to see through the eyes of the government, to see how they saw us, really began my lifelong interest in how the government learns about people and how that information can affect individuals' lives. And in preparation for this, I even went back to look at some of my old Square articles, which I do believe the Square still exists, and found one where I wrote an article about whether DPS could read students' emails, which is a little bit depressing to know whether or not I've actually intellectually matured a lot since college. And the answer is apparently not, because I'm still obsessed with the exact same things. And there were a lot of other moments where I stopped to wonder about police as an institution. When I was at Dickinson, a friend and I drove up to New York City to sit in on the Occupy Wall Street movement in Zuccotti Park. When we saw how global the movement was and how the police reaction looked quite similar to it everywhere in the world, I kind of began to wonder about all of the world's police and how they ended up looking alike and how they ended up acting alike. Then I went to graduate school in New York City and I studied history, and it was there, as I was beginning to read the history of policing, that Eric Garner was killed by the NYPD in Staten Island. And I really committed myself to asking the question, where did this modern police department come from and why does it act the way it does? And this brings me to my current book project, Police in the Empire City, which is out now from Duke University Press, wherever books are sold, including in the lobby. And the book is a century-spanning history examining how race, immigration, empire, and global circuits of knowledge were the primary engine of police modernization. Consideration of diversifying cities in the late 19th and early 20th centuries is what transformed police from this. Very explicitly, as cities became more diverse, it mandated that police change, and it would catalyze this transition. Our modern police department and the way it operates, who it hires, the technology it uses, the information it collects, was all very explicitly catalyzed by nationwide attempts to subordinate immigrant and non-white communities in New York City, the United States, and really the rest of the world, because then the United States began to export its style of policing to the rest of the world. And although it's a work of history, I found that my job working in technology policy and civil liberties now has made me realizing how staggeringly relevant this work, the historical work, was to our current political and policy moment. So here are some of the most important things I've learned spending 10 years of my life studying the history of policing. and also some major myths that I think need dispelling about the modern police department. The first is that the modern police department was assembled at a time when talking about race and talking about crime were explicitly the exact same thing. Police knew then what they know now. You can't police crime. Crime is an amorphous category. It is an act that happens. You can't really police it. So what police had to do then, because they couldn't predict crime, even though they tried then and still do, was they had to do a calculus of what type of person is most likely to commit crimes. And once you have figured that out, those are the people you harass and surveil. Those are the neighborhoods you occupy. Because police, scientists, doctors were not shy in blaming particular races on particular crimes in the 19th and 20th century. This meant that they built a police department specifically designed to control specific minority communities. That was its purpose, because they thought that crime was committed only by a particular type of people, so you only needed a police department that was good at occupying and controlling specific neighborhoods. And no, there was no magic time where police were not concerned with race. Before the modern police department, and even after the official founding of the New York City Police Department in 1845, police were called upon to protect people's property from theft. But guess what the most valuable property in the United States was at that time? It was enslaved people of African descent. And even though some historians in the room might note that slavery had been abolished in New York in the 1830s, in 1850, Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act, with deputized local police departments, even in free states like New York, to surveil black communities and to try to find people who might have escaped from slavery. And this is just an article from the Daily Herald in 1960, in which the Board of Commissioners voted on a resolution that would have exempted the NYPD from enforcing the fugitive slave law, and it didn't pass. But what did pass at that same meeting is that police were no longer allowed to drink alcohol in uniform. So in addition to local police departments very early on in the history of policing being called upon to enforce fugitive slavery, even in the urban north, the same thing, a very similar thing happened at a very similar time, which is in 1848, New York and other cities in the Northeast saw a massive influx of Irish immigration. And as they arrived, they arrived alongside really vicious stereotypes about Irish proclivity for crime and violence. And so between slavery and Irish immigration, this brand new police force, which had only been around now for 3 years, 3 to 5 years, already had to spend an incredible amount of its resources and time thinking about race and ethnicity, right from the very beginning. And the second myth is that there's a sense that police, because police look alike everywhere, that it must be a natural way in which societies organize themselves. But actually, there is nothing natural about the fact that police all over the world look similar. The police department had to be built slowly and painstakingly over time. The modern police department is a global composite of tactics, technologies, and methodologies and physical material from all over the world. I like to think of the police department like a computer, in which your graphics card comes from one place, and your motherboard comes from another, and a keyboard from another, and a monitor from the other. The police department had to be built in a very similar way. Fingerprinting comes from British-occupied India. The criminal file is from Germany. The idea of modus operandi, the idea that one person commits the same crime over and over again, is from Italy. Police dogs had been exported from Cuba, specifically trained for this purpose, since the time of slavery. So it suggests that policing is a shared global endeavor, that policing is a collaborative endeavor in which police departments from all over the world have been in contact for over a century and have been thinking together about what is the best way to control people, especially racial and ethnic minorities in our own individual countries. And this brings me to the period I want to talk about today, which is the period between the 1890s and 1920s, because it's a period that I argue gave us the police department we have today. And it emerges with a problem. And the problem is that all of the experts agreed during this time period that policing just did not work. Policing in the 1890s and 1920s, it didn't work. There was no way of controlling crime. And the reason it did not work is because American cities were becoming too diverse. In 1880, 80% of New York City was born with their first language as English, and by 1920, that number was under 40%. So in 1906, the new New York City Police Commissioner, William McAdoo, saw immediately upon taking his post, he described the Lower East Side, where a majority of New York's immigrants lived, as the closeness of the living quarters, the narrowness of the streets, and the mixture of races makes it the most complex and difficult police problem on any similar place on earth. The fact that there were so many different types of people in the city who spoke different languages, had different cultures, really kind of scared the hell out of police. In the early 20th century, it was not a given that an Irish police officer could effectively police an Italian community. It was not a given that a German detective could go into a predominantly Chinese neighborhood and solve a crime. Police, politicians, and their wealthy benefactors were really disturbed that these dense and supposedly impenetrable immigrant neighborhoods really manifested as a piece of unknowable terrain that was supposedly immune to police intervention or gaze. There was reoccurring stories that immigrants would run into a really narrow, dense neighborhood and would disappear, and nobody there could speak English enough to tell the police where they had gone, even if they were willing to. Sometimes, a lot of time, they were unwilling to. Police would often be ignorant of the cultures that they were trying to police. They didn't know if somebody had a feud with somebody else. They didn't understand the kind of culture and the relationships in the neighborhood. They didn't speak the language. And even worse, police often had such a bad reputation in Black and immigrant communities for beating up and harassing people kind of indiscriminately that communities just didn't trust the police. They wouldn't speak to them. In 1906, one New York City newspaper described Chinatown like this, quote, "The mysteries hid behind those walls, the crime-polluted back alleys and cellars, the dungeon dives, the secret life of thugs and thieves and feuds and slavery, these are not seen." Because of the insular community and the supposedly the unknowability of this culture to American-born police, they said, quote, "Police cannot get evidence of the conspiracy or of murder even when it is committed." I found one police officer who said, quote, "I'd be willing to wager a fair sum that 100 murders have been committed in Chinatown without a word of such crimes reaching the ears of police." But even though there was such a panic about the unknowability of Chinatown and other immigrant neighborhoods, as one officer was quoted saying, bars where black men and white women mixed were, quote, "far more dangerous for a certain type of white woman than all of Chinatown." And so what does this show us? It shows us that, one, even as police panicked about immigrant crime, their rhetoric and their statistics show us that Black New Yorkers were still, and especially Black women, were still disproportionately targeted by police. And two, it sets us up for what happened next. Because in the first decades of the 20th century, 120 years ago, police had to rebuild policing in a way that could effectively control, through force and surveillance, a much diversifying country. But now I'll start us at the same place where I started when I started my research, which was a very specific murder that came to illustrate police and the white public's fears of immigrant crime. So on the morning of April 14th, 1903, a baker named Frances Connor was walking to open up her bakery on the corner of Avenue D and 11th Street when she noticed something strange on the corner. She noticed a bit of a man's overcoat hanging out of a barrel left with the other garbage on the side of the road. And when she got a little bit closer, she discovered that inside the barrel was a man with his throat slit, and importantly, a note in his pocket that was written in Italian. Within days, for obvious reasons, it became known as the barrel murder. And the story shocked an already scared American-born public. For one thing, the discovery of the murdered man, whose name was Meduna Benedetto, occurred only 2 weeks after the so-called Sack murder in Brooklyn. And you can probably guess why it was called the Sack murder, because the body was found in exactly the same way in a sack on the side of the road. And to make matters worse, within a few weeks, neither murder had been solved. In the days following the barrel murder, headlines like "Italian crime and police incompetence" blared across the front pages of major newspapers. It said, quote, "The city is confronted with an Italian problem with which, at present time, it sees unable to cope. The NYPD's official year-end report, the official report from the NYPD in 1908 said, quote, "We're trying to handle medieval criminals, men whose blood runs the spirit of vendetta by modern Anglo-Saxon procedure." So the idea is that Italians were so foreign, their biology, their blood was so different from Americans that modern policing science just didn't work on them, that their behavior was so irrational and foreign, it defied the logics of what people understood about crime and policing. So where did solutions to this problem come from? You have this big problem in policing, and so what did the NYPD try to do to solve it? And it's where you get quotes like this. "Whilst the American soldier is unsurpassed in war, he does not make the best policeman, especially among a people whose language and customs are new and strange to him." And this sounds like almost every quote I've read you so far about fears of immigrant crime. But it's actually not from New York. It comes from the Taft Commission report on the state of the U.S. occupation of the Philippines in 1901. And so we see that in the Philippines, a very diverse multilingual archipelago occupied by the United States military after 1898, they are grappling with the exact same question that they are grappling in New York and the exact same time. And the solutions, and not only the solutions, but the people who propose the solutions are the same. Because one thing I found is that when you get into the papers of the police commissioners, of the police inspectors, of the high-up people who are making decisions at the police departments, not just in New York, but in other major police departments in the United States, what you learn is so many of them have experience in the U.S. empire, in the Philippines, in Cuba, in Puerto Rico, in the Panama Canal Zone, because before they became police, they were generals, they were colonels, and after the police, they went back to being generals and colonels in World War I. And so the solution that they came up in the Philippines and the same one that they proposed in New York was what they called native policing, a style of governance in which colonial occupiers would recruit people from the cultures they were policing and send them into their own communities to do the policing for the occupying force. And this brings us back to Meduna Benedetto, how his body ended up in that barrel and what happens next. Because the barrel murder's only conviction was attained at the hands of New York City's first and only Italian detective, Joseph Petrosino. And the case cemented his fame nationally and even internationally. Here's a picture of him, and this is a comic book of him where they called him the Sherlock Holmes of Italy, and even after his death, kind of circulated in Italy as he kind of became an international star. So the concerns over Italian crime led to what was essentially native policing on American soil. It led to the creation of the Italian Squad, which started in 1904 under Petrosino and consisted of 6 Italian-speaking detectives whose only job it was to handle Italian crimes in Italian neighborhoods. And to show you how important this was deemed, it had 6 members in 1904, and by 1907 it was up to 100 members. And it was a centralized squad organized exclusively around the ethnicity and language skills of the men who were recruited. And something like this had only been tried one time before in the NYPD, and it was the exact same year. It was earlier in 1904 when a steamboat taking a German church congregation to a picnic north of the city caught on fire and sank. And because so many of the victims were German and so many of their families were exclusively German-speaking, they rallied every German-speaking officer in the city to a centralized squad whose job it was solely to deal with the fallout of this disaster. And this was called the German Squad, and it happened the exact same year. And there was another one. 1904, the same exact year, the NYPD recruited Warren Charles, who was the first NYPD officer of Chinese descent, who was recruited after spending years as an informant in Chinatown. It's actually really interesting. Warren Charles, unlike the Italian detectives and the German detectives, actually refused to police Chinatown. He said he had visions of it being like a circus ring where he said there'd be like tourists would come and gawk at a Chinese man in a blue uniform policing Chinatown. So he actually refused to police that neighborhood in a way that other detectives would. And so this tactic might seem like a relatively basic tool of policing, but what my book shows is rather painstakingly, it was specifically and explicitly a piece of colonial technology brought back from the U.S. occupation of the Philippines and Cuba, where it was then, where from there it was borrowed from colonial regimes by countries like England and France, who had been using native policing as a tactic already for the better part of a century. And in case people think this might look a little bit familiar, it should, because in the wake of 9/11, the NYPD created a centralized detective squad of Arabic speakers, people who understood Islam as a religion and who understood Muslim communities in New York, under a centralized squad called the Demographic Squad, which is really kind of innocuously named in a way that makes my skin crawl. But even in New York's black neighborhoods, who had been trying for decades to find ways to curb police brutality, the way they had really settled on is they needed the recruitment of black officers. And in trying to make claims for this, they often said that we need the elevation of a, quote, black Lieutenant Petrosino. They understood their own appointment to the police force in the same way that immigrants were being appointed to the police force. And yet it was obviously more complicated because black New Yorkers spoke English, and so there wasn't the kind of cultural divide. And even though white detectives couldn't really gain access to black social spaces in much the same way that American-born detectives couldn't gain access to Italian social spaces, the NYPD really never really said that they needed black officers. They didn't need black translators in a way they needed police from other cultures to do the same thing. And so it took 7 years of really concerted activism on the part of New York's black communities for there to finally be a desegregation of the NYPD. And even though they never admitted that they really needed Samuel Battle, who became the first black NYPD officer in 1911, he often described himself as a translator. He often said that his unit needed him more than they needed him more than he needed them, because he was often the black officer in a all-white precinct in majority black neighborhoods. So even this kind of modeled itself in a way after what had come earlier in the ethnic squads and in bringing home so-called native policing. And despite the fact that it returns the demographic squad, or in its more recognizable form, community policing, this attempt at policing a really diverse city failed for a number of reasons. For the most part, it's because, if you have 100 Italian-speaking officers and a community of 300,000 Italians in New York, pretty soon those 100 officers get pretty famous. And when they get famous, it really kills their utility in trying to solve crimes or go undercover. And so their usefulness kind of is phased out. A lot of them are actually assassinated by the early mafia. And the other reason is because rising xenophobia in the United States at this time was calling for a complete end to all immigration to the United States. And not only that, there was a massive supersizing of our ability to deport people. This is really the moment where deportation becomes a tool of crime fighting, in which the NYPD themselves is often collaborating and working with the federal government to build deportation cases against so-called troublemakers in the city. And so because the NYPD stopped kind of trusting immigrant officers, they were looking for new ways, new techniques to identify, track, surveil, and subordinate people that the department really couldn't understand, and at this point were dedicating themselves to not trying to understand. And what emerged is the policing we still live with today, what I call the rise of surveillance policing. This was trying to find technological solutions to human problems. You don't need to be able to speak to a person's neighbor. You don't need to be able to gain cooperation from communities. You don't need to understand neighborhood gossip or feuds if a fingerprint at a crime scene can tell you all there needs to know. And the criminal file, if you can believe it, had to be invented. It had to be invented in Europe and deliberately imported to the United States as a way of organizing policing. And we'll get back to this specific criminal file in a little bit. Identifying somebody pulled off the street in the 1800s was not really an easy matter. People could lie about their names, people could change their appearance enough so that photographs would be less useful, and a lot of mugshots from this era I've seen look like this, is people not even cooperating enough to get a good picture. And so it was really hard to pick somebody off the street and identify them in this period. For years, the primary technology of trying to organize how to identify people was this. It was called the Rogues Gallery, invented in New York, and it was this massive cabinet of faces. So when a person was arrested, you would take the picture, you would put them up on the wall, there'd be a little note on the back that would say their names and any aliases, but it was incredibly unwieldy. Police often described the eyesore they would get from staring up at this wall all day long, and how easy it would be, especially then, to misidentify someone. It also couldn't be shared very easily. Obviously, you can see it's not centralized in any way like, the internet helps police do now. If somebody had been arrested in Cincinnati and they suspected he had been arrested in New York, there really wasn't an easy way short of Cincinnati sending an officer to New York to look at their rogues gallery to figure out if the person you had been arrested before. And so in the 1910s, police started going overseas, just like they had in the US empire, looking for who was innovating in policing, who was coming up with new techniques. And in 1914, the Rockefeller family sent a number of police to Europe, where they embedded themselves in all of these police departments in Europe, and they were given the instruction to go there, find what's interesting, find what they're using, and bring back those tools to the United States. And it was on one of these dozens of trips that police and their financial backers really kind of resulted in the obsession with policing and information and files. And so this is a criminal file from Germany. And when this police officer from the NYPD arrived in Berlin, what he saw there took more, quote, patience and genius than he thought that U.S. police were even capable of mustering. He said, quote, "We have to realize they employ a system over there that we could not employ here in America in 1,000 years. The system he was referring to was the collection of detailed files on over 12 million people, centralized in the Berlin police headquarters. And not only was it centralized in Berlin, but when you traveled to another city in Germany, you were expected to bring a copy of your criminal file with you. You would spread it as you went so that they had a central repository, even when the police department of Cologne and the police department of Berlin could not speak to each other." And so these files were filled with personal information, insurance information, marriage documentation, military records, criminal histories, and then over time, all of these other things you see, photographs, fingerprints, we'll get back to that. And they said, quote, "The files occupy 130 rooms. 15 rooms alone are used for the letter S, and 10 rooms for the letter H. About 25% of the Berlin budget is taken up paying employees who work the police filing system." And the German system was both aspirational for this NYPD officer who was there, but it was also kind of terrifying. He saw these millions of files kept on all these people, a lot of whom had never really committed a crime in their life. And he said, in the United States, "I don't think we would stand for it." And of course, he was wrong, because slowly but surely the United States began to adopt to this model of data collection. And I mean, this is kind of a cautionary tale, because this is Berlin in 1914. In 15 years, the Nazis will take power, and they will inherit a massive, massive collection of information on millions and millions of people in Germany, and we know then what they are capable of doing with all of this information. So the whole time the United States was experimenting with collection of information, one of the problems still was, how do we identify the person we've just arrested? Who is this person? If they don't speak English, if they won't cooperate, if their neighbors won't tell us who they are, if their family won't identify them, how do we know who they are? And so one of the methods that arrives in the 1880 in New York and has a short life is called the Bertillon method, or the French method. And this is kind of seen as an alternative to the rogues gallery. If their eyes get sore looking up at this wall of pictures all day, then here's a new way to do it. And it broke down the human body into 12 measurements. The length of the ear, the length of the nose, the distance between middle fingers, the length of specific middle fingers. And so if you arrest somebody and you measure that their middle finger is 3 inches long, you can go to the file, you can look at all people with 3-inch fingers, and you could see if any of those people also had committed a crime. And so this might be the new way of identifying a person. And the U.S. police departments are really fast adopters of this, in part because it became very highly recommended from the police departments in Europe, who had, once again, learned about how useful this was in their overseas empires. France especially, in all parts of, especially West Africa, had very, very detailed Bertillon measures on hundreds, if not hundreds of thousands of people in some of these colonies. And so police in the United States, listening to their European colonial brothers, really quickly adapted it. But we can see kind of why this doesn't work either. It's incredibly cumbersome. It requires a lot of cooperation. And because no two people measure somebody's finger the exact same way, if you are a few millimeters off, suddenly the entire system does not work. So in case you were wondering if there's any pushback against all of this collection of information, there absolutely was. In a number of incidents between the 1890s and the 1910s, there were court cases, there were pieces of legislation, including a case that went all the way to the state Supreme Court of New York that argued that the retention of information about people by the police, especially if they would eventually be found innocent of the crime, but the collection of information just because they've been arrested is a real hindrance to a person's reputation and their future employment. As one Kentucky newspaper said, quote, "This type of policy is utterly indefensible. It is a cruel injustice and a constant bar to reform. Youthful indiscretion is put on the same plane with murder. Nobody is going to employ a young man or woman whose picture adorns the rogues gallery." And so there were all these really intense legal challenges to the system of data collection in the early 20th century. But in the wake of all these demographic shifts, in the wake of the failure of the Italian squad, police still thought they needed a good and reliable way to not let immigrants lean into their foreignness and avoid detection. And this is where technologies like fingerprints emerged to fill the gap. To police in the 1900s, fingerprinting was like magic. Not only could you take somebody's fingerprint and identify them from fingerprints that are on file, think about it. It was a new way of solving crimes. For a century or more, there was no way of solving a crime if there was no witnesses. If you would have to have a suspect drop a pocket watch with their name engraved in it at the scene of a crime, because otherwise you just could not solve the crime. There was no way of doing it. And so fingerprinting was this kind of magic piece of technology where police could wander into a crime scene days or weeks or months later, dust the scene for prints, find a fingerprint, and then use it to try to identify a person and arrest a person. It destroyed time and space in a way that police really did think was magic. And the usefulness of fingerprinting has, I feel like I'm really repetitive here, but part of its usefulness had to do with how it was developed. The British had tested and used fingerprinting in British-occupied India, where it was so successful, colonial governors brought it back to London and Scotland Yard, and they had so much success with it that the London Police Department brought it to the United States with great fanfare at the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis. Scotland Yard had a massive exhibit at the 1904 World's Fair just to introduce America to the fingerprint. And one Kansas City newspaper who saw this exhibit said that it was unbelievable. They said, quote, "It's not necessary to know a man's age, color, or any circumstance of his life in order to discover his personality by means of the fingerprint method." And let me tell you a really funny anecdote I found about just how kind of quote unquote magical police saw fingerprinting. In 1919, the Essex Street Criminal Court in the Lower East Side of Manhattan that handled all of the immigrant crime moved to a new, larger building. When it moved years, decades of case files to this new courthouse's basement. And in the basement, they really quickly realized that they had a rat problem because rats were chewing into the boxes of documents and just absolutely destroying them. And so what the criminal court did was they put down ink pads, and across the ink pads, they put down blank sheets of white paper. And they found little ink-covered paw prints, and they studied the paw prints of the rats, and they quickly discovered that there were definitely 4 distinct rats that they could identify from the paw prints. And they assigned each of them a name and identity, and they wrote a mock arrest warrant for each of them. And the fingerprint expert for the court said, "There is no doubt that we shall get him. You may quote me as saying authoritatively that science and the law never fail. I have the fingerprints and the rest is easy." So the article might have been like kind of a parody. I mean, it was presented in a humorous way, but it conveyed a really real sentiment being pushed by academics and police about this technology, which is that you could take a creature as uncompliant, inhuman, and supposedly produce results that police could use to exert control over them. And this is, very, very explicitly mapped onto the immigrants that they are supposedly policing, who are foreign, who cannot communicate with police, and yet nonetheless, fingerprinting serves as a vital role in identifying these people and controlling them in a way that does not require them to recruit people with language skills or does not require them to learn language or talk to people. And this is the start of a really important trend, because neighborhoods can become illegible or uncooperative with police for a number of reasons, because of their foreignness, because of their reluctance to talk. And yet this has kind of become a cornerstone of 21st century policing. And I can name a number of technologies that kind of illustrate this point, but one I really pointed to is ShotSpotter. I don't know if many of you are familiar with ShotSpotter, but ShotSpotter are high-powered microphones that cities place at intersections, which are supposedly enhanced by AI, and they can detect loud noises, and they could detect whether something is a car backfire or a firework or a gunshot. They're usually wrong. And they can triangulate where the sound came from and send police to that location. We see a number of problems with this. One of them is that they end up often sending police to the site of children playing with firecrackers, thinking they're walking into a gunfight. So it's incredibly dangerous, and a number of, especially black youth, have been killed as a result of these ShotSpotter alerts. But the other thing that it shows us, and we can see its lineage from this moment, is that police don't trust neighborhoods to call police even when they hear gunshots. That they have to build a high-tech regime of surveillance that kind of papers over this chasm between communities and police. That you don't need to be able to trust the community to call the police if they hear a gunshot if you have a piece of technology that will do it for you. And we can say the exact same thing about Amazon Ring, about the proliferation of surveillance cameras that people can just screw into the front of their houses. Police now almost barely bother to canvass for witnesses or knock on doors and talk to people. What they do instead is they survey for cameras and they send a request over the internet, and they never actually have to talk to people because these have become the digital witnesses. You don't need to actually talk to anybody or gain cooperation of communities if these regimes of technology really end up doing that for you. And we can see the foundations of it in this moment. But the mass collection of information didn't just stop when it came to individuals. In this same period, in an attempt to modernize and streamline policing, departments turned to statistics, hiring dozens of statisticians to crunch numbers about every accident and every crime reported by police, who are now required to carry index cards with them. Police, as far back as 1914, believed that if they mapped every single incident of crime, every arrest, every accident, that they could proactively and even predictively shape patrols and figure out where crime was going to happen next. And if this sounds like AI predictive policing, you are absolutely right. It is the exact same principle. And yet again, we can see a common thread. Math and statistics would supposedly do what police were often unable to do. And we also see the problem with it and what it still has to do with racial inequality. Because police make arrests where they're stationed. Those arrests lead to tally marks on a map. The more tally marks there are in a neighborhood, the more it looks like that neighborhood is crime-ridden, and the more it justifies increased policing. And if you put any neighborhood under a microscope in the way specifically black neighborhoods in America have been put under microscopes, police are going to make arrests for jaywalking, for vandalism, for drinking in public, for underage people smoking cigarettes they shouldn't have gotten a hold of. And these are crimes that would happen in any neighborhood, but when the police are only located in one neighborhood, all of those become statistics. And the statistics become justification for further and further policing the same neighborhoods. And this is, people say math can't be racist, but the results that can be drawn from math can be racist because of where the data comes from that is fed into this supposedly objective way of doing policing. And all of this is what I mean when I often say that newspapers I read in 1901 kind of give me historian's vertigo about how they remind me of headlines I've read in 2024. Studying the modernization of the modern police departments had me bumping into histories of other debates that we're still having today, about face recognition and biometric data, about the militarization of police, about whether diversifying a police force actually has an impact on brutality, about a lot of other reforms that have been tried in the past and failed, and we've kind of forgotten that they failed, and now we try them again, and about the criminalization of immigrants, about global cooperation, including between American police departments and police departments overseas that might not have the best records when it comes to human rights violations. The tools that police use now are digital, but what we ask those tools to do is exactly the same as it was in the early 20th century. It's how we go from this, the Bertillon method, where they're measuring somebody's ear to identify them, to this, which is face recognition, which operates on the exact same principles, but digitally. And it's how we go from this rigorous classroom training officers that they could identify the make and model of cars based on the tiniest details to this, having AI do it for us. We have all this new technology, and yet what we're asking it to do is the same functions that policing have always done. And ultimately, we're still searching for these technical solutions to old problems that are baked into the structure of the police department based on how they were founded and what they were founded to do. Technology has always been a Band-Aid, a potential fix on these irreconcilable problems, and one of those problems is the hurdle of American demographics. And and here's an example of old patterns coming back to haunt us. Every few years, scientists supposedly find ways of predicting whether a person is going to be a criminal based on the shape of their face, based on their DNA, based on any number of things. And this is an 1880s type of science that we've applied computers to, and we think somehow it's different and somehow we're going to get less racist results, but we're really not. And this new style of policing became the status quo. Plans to build a similar system to what the NYPD officer saw in Berlin, where they were collecting millions of files on millions of people, continued unabated, especially after the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or a form of a federal law enforcement agency, started picking up steam in the 1920s because they really ramped up data collection. And I'll show you an example. In 1924, this is what the FBI fingerprinting lab looked like. You can see that they're all standing at filing cabinets. So all of these are filled with individual files containing people's fingerprints. It's not a very large room. This is what it looked like in 1924. This is in the 1930s. The room gets a little bit bigger, still standing at filing cabinets. And this is what that same department looked like in 1944. By the time the FBI was able to use computers, computers were capable of handling less data than its previous system of filing could handle, because they had gotten down to a science, how to handle so much information on so many different types of people. And now, in 2024, local police departments have surveillance powers that science fiction writers could barely have dreamed of just a generation ago. And it's all predicated on mass collection of information. And the desire to collect all that information, I really think you have to show that it comes from this period, a time when police had the choice whether or not they could learn about communities and build cooperations, or they could invent technologies that would make that unnecessary. And this shows ultimately that policing is itself a kind of antiquated technology that does not serve its function incredibly well, but instead continues to fail in the same ways it did in the early 20th century and continues to find technological fixes to that problem. Thank you very much.
It is now time for the question and answer session. So that everyone in the audience and our speaker can hear your question clearly, please raise your hand and wait for a microphone to reach you before asking your question. We reserve the first questions for students, and then we will open it up to the rest of the audience. We will now take the first question.
Hello. I was just curious have you ever given a presentation like this to any members of law enforcement community, and if so, what was that dialogue like?
That's a good question. I've never given a talk like this to police, but I have talked to a few law enforcement agents who have read my book. And the funny thing is, and this is, I think, a testament to the power of history, is they don't really dispute it. You know, like, the document is pretty painstakingly detailed. I did a lot of archival research. I really back up my findings with documents from inside the NYPD at the era. And so I think the difference is that when we walk away from that conversation is they see it as part of a kind of a proud history of law enforcement, that this is just how it happened, and they think that it does not represent a kind of irreconcilable problem about policing going forward. And I tend to think that getting into the history shows us that the police department was made to serve a particular function, which is racial subordination, and it still serves that function despite the fact that the language is different, the rhetoric is different, and the technology is different. So, I mean, I've had pretty good conversations with law enforcement about the findings of the book. They think the book is interesting. They like reading old stories about innovating law enforcement in this period. I think just the conclusions we draw from this story are quite different.
First of all, thank you for this talk. And second of all, my question is, how would you, given how policing exists today, what are some things you would do to help reform it and address some of the issues that you discussed today?
Yeah, that's the big question. I mean, I really think first and foremost what you need to do is limit interactions between law enforcement officers and individuals. I think that interactions between the public and police is when violence happens. And if your end goal is to prevent unnecessary violence, the first and foremost thing you need to do is just limit those interactions as much as humanly possible. And that looks like forming alternate institutions that, for instance, handle calls about unhoused people, that handle wellness checks for police encountering people in mental health crisis. It looks like unarmed people not doing traffic enforcement. I mean, the fact that the same people we send to get into shootouts are the same people who are responsible for pulling people over and giving people tickets is a recipe for violence. And so I think the first and foremost is you need to start to create other institutions who can take away a lot of responsibilities from police and who can start to have some of these interactions with the public. And these are institutions that I think are unarmed and that have real, actual, honest-to-God de-escalation training, which a lot of police might get on a surface level, but have proven they're not very good at. So I think first and foremost, you just have to limit interactions between the police and the public. There are a number of other things. I think something I work on a lot in my day job is, a simple thing cities can start to do is pass what are called CCOPS laws, community control over police surveillance. And what this looks like is when police want to invest in an incredibly new, sometimes dangerous, invasive surveillance technology, at the very least, it should go before the city council and it should get voted on. People who are in office, who are voted in office, people who can be voted out of office should be making the decisions on some of these tools that police departments can use, because otherwise you or I or the average person has absolutely no say over what happens in police departments, over what technologies they're buying and how they're using them. So one very easy way is to start to take democratic controls over some of these really unaccountable and arbitrary ways that police behave. And the other thing is, maybe trying to phase out police in general, is trying to think about this in a holistic way and think about, as we take more and more and more responsibilities away from police, thinking about other institutions that we can form now that serve a lot of these functions in aggregate, but which might not necessarily look like traditional police departments existing in 150 years from now, just like they existed 150 years ago. I often try to think about it in terms of like the history of medicine, that if you were treating an illness for 100 years with the same cure, say leeches, and leeches never really produced a cure to that disease, wouldn't you eventually say, it's time to try something new? It's time to try a new, because we're concerned about crime, just like we're concerned about this illness. And so it's time to try a new solution. And I really think if you think of the police department as a technology, something that was invented and served a specific purpose, now in 2024, we have to ask, does it still serve that purpose? Is it producing safety for everyone? Is it even really that good at controlling crime? And if the answer is no to a lot of those things, then it might be time to try to innovate and come up with something else.
Thank you so much for your talk. I'm interested in your background as a policy analyst, your work at the Electronic Frontier Front, and then also being a co-editor and scholar of a work on the Kerner Commission. My question is, why did the Kerner Commission fail? Because I would say that the Kerner Commission is arguably the most devastating and true just US government being naked about race and what it believes about itself and its potential. And I was wondering if you have reflections on the Kerner Commission's study of policing, their policy recommendations essentially, and being like, I can't do math on the spot, but written in 1968, you have a document that is outlining everything wrong with the police, everything that's been wrong with the police, how the police responded to LA, Detroit, Newark. Why did it fail?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So for people who aren't familiar with the Kerner Commission, it was a congressional investigation into the kind of uprisings of the 1960s, the kind of racial violence that we were seeing, the mass disorder in cities, and it was an investigation into how these happened. How do we get to a place where all of these cities are embroiled in these very direct action, very kind of often violent, often fiery protests in the 1960s, and their findings are essentially, in general, that the state of racial inequality in America is producing the conditions in which these types of uprisings are inevitable. That it has to do with housing, it has to do with public health, it has to do with education, it has to do with economic inequality and the unavailability of good jobs in certain neighborhoods, and it has to do with police violence. And it has a pretty stark diagnosis of the problem. The thing is, it doesn't result in any solutions. You can diagnose the problem all day long, but if you're not willing to propose new solutions as to what comes next, then it doesn't become an incredibly helpful document. And I think to some extent the findings were suppressed, ignored in a way, because a lot of the white public didn't want to hear that they were somehow responsible for the really fiery uprisings of the 1960s. They did not want to hear that somehow racial inequality, especially post the Voting Rights Act, post the Civil Rights Act, that somehow even after that, that white racism was to blame for these protests. And so people were kind of unwilling, I think, to grapple with what the Kerner Commission report found, and they didn't really propose any long-lasting or effective solutions to the problems that they themselves discovered. And so I think, it's not enough to diagnose the problem, and I think the Kerner Commission diagnosed it very well. But I think what came next was an unwillingness to grapple with what that means and what should come next. It's a very good question. Thank you.
As AI becomes more prevalent, especially in law enforcement, how concerned are you about, like, say, the creation of deepfakes of police brutality incidents that make police look more sympathetic than they are?
That's really interesting. Police kind of already have a way of doing that in the form of body cameras. In most jurisdictions, police control body camera footage, and they are able to splice and dice it to reiterate police's version of events. So I don't think necessarily police need to become masters of the AI deepfake in order to learn how to perpetuate their own narratives. In part also because a lot of reporters still, when they report on what happened, and specifically an incident of police violence, often repeat verbatim police's side of events. So I don't think police need a lot of help in perpetuating their version of events by using AI deepfake. But I am very concerned with AI in law enforcement, in part because there are a number of steps along the way from arrest all the way through parole, in which AI is currently already being deployed to decide somebody's fate and their freedom. So predictive policing models are sometimes even identifying individuals who might commit a crime in the future. And police are watching them so diligently that the first time they run a red light, they say, "We knew it. We knew you would commit a crime," and they're arrested. But this is also happening, like, they are putting in people's demographic information, their upbringing information, how much money they make, their family histories, to decide whether or not they deserve to be out on bail or not. Computers are now deciding whether or not a person should have their freedom. And these algorithms are often for-profit companies, and because it's proprietary information, even defense attorneys are not given access in court to information on how they work and how they arrived at that answer. So the answer is, I'm very concerned in the merging of AI and policing, in part because we are giving it power to make decisions that it has no right making.
Hey, Matt.
Hello.
I was wondering, you had a really interesting discussion talking about native policing and how it occurs at basically the turn of the century. What I found an interesting parallel, well, I was wondering if there is an ebb and flow to this cyclically as you go throughout actually the 20th century. Because there's what I found was an interesting parallel, what was happening actually at the Carlisle Indian School, is that in the 1880s, there's very much a sense of that obviously you're breaking off any kind of relationship with the older Indian reservation. You're trying to create a new white civilization with these native populations. But then what happens actually around the end of the 1890s into the 1900s is that the school begins to bring in Indian teachers to teach native students about native life, which goes against exactly what Pratt was attempting to do in the beginning of the 1880s, but because of the particular kind of political dynamics and Wounded Knee happening in 1890, the end of what was sort of the end of the Indian Wars, that there's now this belief that we've been successful, that the Indian is vanishing, and now you're beginning to integrate Indian education into the Carlisle Indian School, which sounds strange, but actually it works in a parallel logic to what you're talking about with native policing, or it happens at the same time, which makes me wonder, are there broader trends that are happening in that is lending itself more towards this notion that there are cultural elements within any particular culture that are going to be paramount in the attempt at regulating that culture, and instead of having to go wholesale into what we might understand as white civilization at any given particular moment. And my guess is that as you go throughout the 20th century, there's going to be the kind of ebb and flow, right? That there are going to be moments where native policing, or whatever you want to call it, at a certain moment is going to be at an ebb, and there are certain moments it's going to be at a peak. And I was wondering, do you see that throughout the 20th century, or is that just a moment that seems to happen at the turn of the century and doesn't happen later?
Yeah, that's a good question. There were a few ethnic revivals over the 20th century in which, and it usually is in response to civil rights movements. Like, there is a resurgence of political power and black pride amongst African Americans, and as a result, white ethnic groups and other racial groups refined their own kind of cultural heritage and their own cultural pride, and it's like reasserted in very public and often very political ways. So there's definitely a kind of like resurgence in kind of ethnic knowledge and ethnic thinking, but often in a way that reiterates their belonging. So I think in the Philippines, there's this emphasis in creating Filipinos who are self-disciplining. That first you have to teach them how to rise to American civilization, quote unquote, through forced English language, through American-style schools, through religion that reiterates how making oneself vulnerable to U.S. state control is good for you, it's good for your country. And then comes the revisionist idea of actually, in many ways, Filipino cultural heritage has been compatible with American culture all along. And so I think in some ways this is what you're talking about, where it is a type of revisionist history in a way where we are going to teach, we're going to go back to teaching native culture, but we're going to do it in a way that reinforces rather than undermines a decade or more of kind of brutal forced Americanization being shoved down your throat. Yeah.
We have time for 2 more questions.
Can you hear me? All right?
Yeah.
Okay. So thank you for your talk. I was wondering about 2 things, which may be connected, but you can take it in any direction is helpful for you. First is about the social construction of the category of crime and the criminal. So you had used as a kind of loose analogy, leeches not being helpful, medicine, right? This is just an analogy, not anything historically specific necessarily, but to solve the problem of crime. And I'm wondering if we want to critique the role of policing in American society, that would also necessitate a critique of the social category, the political category, and legal category of crime and criminalization, and we'd have to abolish that category as well if policing and crime are sort of in a self-closed vicious cycle or a loop, a self-justifying cycle. So that's the first aspect. The second aspect would be if we also see how these technologies are imported from US imperialism, if we might think about anti-colonial movements as they've existed to combat those forms of native policing. And if that is relevant to not reforms, but actually combating and understanding a domestic military occupying force in this country today, which goes under the name of the police. Thanks.
Yeah, in terms of the social construction of crime, I think, what gets called and prioritized as crime and what does not is always a matter of discretion of police and of the state. So when you think, for instance, about the fact that employers withholding money from their employees far, far, far and away is more money than is stolen in terms of retail theft, in terms of all kind of property-related crime in America. Far more money employers steal from their employees every year, withholding it from their paychecks in the form of wage theft, and yet that doesn't get nearly the same kind of panic that people pocketing something from Target gets in the local news. And you also don't see, if police departments were going to dedicate their resources and time to the size of crime, then employers withholding wages from their employees would be what most police departments did all the time. And yet most police, I would venture to guess, have never really thought twice about this unless there's like an immediate story about like an employer breaking into an employee's locker and like stealing cash from their wallet. And so thinking about what crime is and where it exists and how we have been kind of conditioned to think about crime only as to, crime is what police. There is a whole category of crime that would fit the kind of general description of what is crime, who is it hurting, people are being harmed, and yet police don't really think about it at all. So, I think there are a lot of examples of things exactly like that, that once we broaden our scope of thinking about harm and safety holistically, and we think about what are the things that actually make people unsafe. There are cities in America who, through criminal negligence, have had undrinkable water for years. Is that a crime? Certainly police don't seem really intent on finding the people responsible for it and policing it like it is retail theft. And yet, it has harmed a lot of people who are disproportionately black and working class. And so I think that, we have to think about crime, we have to think about harms rather than crime, because we have come to think of crime solely as what police are against and not as a set of larger societal things that hurt real people and have real effects on people's lives. The other question about Native policing is that there is a long history of solidarity struggles in which people at the time understood their connections. There are black New Yorkers who are undergoing almost weekly, neighborhood-wide brutalizations by white pedestrians and police. And at local protests, they often compare themselves to Filipinos. They often say that they feel like they are living in a colonial regime, and that all of this concern is going out to people on the other side of the world, but they are experiencing exactly the same thing in New York, and nobody seems to care. And there are global movements who are thinking about this. There's something that's endlessly fascinating. In 1917, there's something called the Hindu Panic, which happens in the UK, Canada, and to a lesser extent in the United States, in which the British government believes that in the wake of World War I, Indian nationalists who want Indian independence will use this moment as a time to launch a global campaign for independence. And they are on the lookout for Indian nationalist terrorism in the United States, in Canada, and in England. So much so that they are constantly reaching out to the NYPD and putting the very small South Asian population of New York under constant surveillance in 1917. And so there are kind of global solidarity movements and networks that are linked with anti-colonial causes that understand the interrelation of these movements, but also police understand that interconnection as well. And police across the world are interested in and feel threatened by the potential for a globalized movement against colonialism.
This concludes tonight's presentation. Please join me in thanking Dr. Guariglia.